chair. I'd actually rather lean, so. All right, good. All right, we're on. So, welcome everyone. This is our second Digital Liberal Arts event for the 2017-18 academic year. It's a faculty panel, and as you can see from the slide, it is web culture in the disciplines. If you're interested in tweeting about the event or sharing about the event on social media, the hashtag is DOOO. I'm Lee Scaller-Bassett. I'm an instructional technology specialist at the Division of Teaching and Learning Technologies here at UMW. And I'm going to be moderating this discussion. And with that, I will let our illustrious faculty panelists introduce themselves. Yeah.
I'm Will McIntosh from the Department of History and American Studies here at UMW.
My name is Chad Murphy. I'm from the Department of Political Science here at UMW.
I'm Jason Robinson from the Department of Art and Art History.
And I'm Mary Beth Matthews from the Department of Classics, Philosophy, and Religion, also at UMW.
I'm Marcel Rotter, and I'm from the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures.
John Broom from the College of Education.
Great, thanks. Thank you all for being here today in this dreary weather, and thank you all for agreeing to take part in this, I think, really important discussion for us here at Mary Washington. So I set these questions ahead of time to the panelists just to get the conversation going and get it started. So I'll start with the first question that they got from me that I'm going to ask them to comment on, which is, how has the internet more generally and social media more specifically changed your discipline, either in how knowledge is disseminated and shared or in how you teach within the discipline? Not a small question at all. So whoever wants to jump in, just go ahead.
Well, I guess speaking for political science, one of the big things we've done is really evaluate our roles as sharing our knowledge with political discussion in general. As anybody who's participated in political discussion on the internet knows, it's it's a varying quality, being very generous.
Very diplomatic.
Yes. So one of the big things we've been trying to do is share our research with people in a number of different ways, and that's through social media, by tweeting papers, by tweeting insights. Blogs have been a big part, and things like the Monkey Cage, Mischiefs of Faction have gone on to major media outlets like the Washington Post, like Vox.com. And more importantly, there's been a real discussion in poli-sci about our role sharing what we've learned about politics with the general public and trying to raise the level of discourse recently.
Can I follow up on that briefly? Because I think that that's a similar phenomenon happening within history as a discipline with a little bit of a wrinkle, which is to say historians, I think, are, unlike political scientists, are often really hesitant to engage in politics in the current moment, right? That there's the term historians use is presentism, which is when you're allowing the sort of the present to overly inform your understanding of the past, right? And that is generally understood to be a bad word, right, in the historical profession, but it's one that nevertheless we all have an attraction to, right? That's sort of the dark side. How can our understanding of the past illuminate the present? And I think for professional historians, you know, as much as I think we try to fight presentist instincts in our scholarly work, the presence on digital platforms and particularly on social media, right, the culture is a little bit looser, right? And I think historians feel a lot more comfortable about speaking to our contemporary moment, our contemporary political moment specifically, from a position of historical knowledge on digital media and particularly on social media than they would be in their scholarship, right? So I think it's a little bit like what's happening in political science, but with an even sharper divide where, you know, in our kind of formal peer-reviewed scholarship, we will very self-consciously disengage from the contemporary moment, right? Whereas on social media, we're very consciously engaging with the contemporary moment.
I think I can add that that's happening in religious studies too. And in religious studies in general, there has been a debate about how to engage with the politics and religion debates that happen to sort of overlap with what Chad's talking about, but also the history of this to overlap with what Will's talking about. And religious studies scholars have become much more vocal about explaining what they see and parallels, but they also are concerned about presentism. So you can't judge today's evangelicals by Scope's monkey trial standards. They are not the same kind of evangelicals. But at the same time, social media has given people a platform to clarify and try to correct what reporters will often do, which is to lump, say, all evangelicals into one category. Social media gives the religious studies experts a way to push back and say, no, you need to break down that category. You are making white evangelicals normative, for example. So we get a chance to engage in dialogue with reporters sometimes about what they're doing.
I think within education, it's really complicated. Not only are we talking about the teachers and the students in making sense of things, but in our field, it's really complicated a lot. There are concepts of truth. You know, we've had a standards movement, essentially it's from 1998, and so constantly students and teachers are learning things that are challenging those standards in terms of assessing students, which is difficult. At least within our college, we focus on some theories that help provide order to this besides just media literacy and proficiency. It's really looking at, we use Geneva Gay's concept of culturally responsive teaching, which is there's a formal curriculum, so what the state or government gives us. There's what we do, which is a symbolic curriculum, so the books we choose to use, the videos, what's on our walls, and what it represents, and what we're always fighting is the societal curriculum, which is all the social media, it's all the outside messages that come into classrooms, positive and negatively, which really make actually teaching, not just teachers, but the students much more difficult because they see stuff every day in their social media lives and identities, and they bring it into the classroom, and it may not jive with what's going on in the curriculum. So it really makes teachers' jobs much more difficult.
Yeah, in my case, it's actually a twofold, since we are, languages and literatures on the language level. You would think that social media would lend itself very well, actually, for students to engage, actually, with other people that are not here on campus. However, most of the students are really too timid or not really confident of their German, in my case, and do not really want to engage. I mean, I tried it a couple of times, and they really don't want to do it. And I tried it with blogs, and there were sometimes responses that you didn't really know how to handle because you're way over the head. So that was a little bit difficult. I probably have to find some other approaches here because I think it's generally probably a good way because especially since it's on a more relaxed level. And in terms of literature, here I'm fighting the fight that the students use reliable sources and not just Google. And we had our library workshop, and we did go over how to evaluate online sources, and we know how to go into the databases in the library. And I still had just yesterday a student who gave a presentation and cited from some computer science blog page on our German literature. And I said, no, really, you couldn't find anything better when we just went over all that. There was nothing on the Brothers Grimm that was actually, it's not like some hidden author. It's the Brothers Grimm. You wouldn't find anything more scholarly than something from a computer website. And that's the fight I keep fighting. It's just that they are so used to the Googling and they don't want to go the right way. That's a tough one.
I think for me, probably the biggest thing is access, and as a studio artist, especially teaching digital art, that you do have access to all of these movies and videos, like from the past 120 years that maybe used to be really hard to find. But the flip side of that, of being able to find this experimental animation from New Zealand from 1953 that you've only read about, and all of a sudden you can find it on YouTube, is that maybe someone changed the soundtrack, or decided to do a remix of it and then didn't say anything, or maybe I've had instances before where you think you found something and it's a project that someone did where they were trying to mimic that exact video, and it looks like it, and you're like, oh, I found this, and then you look at it for a second, and you're like, I don't think so. I think there's something. I don't think that was it, And so, and the another part that sort of goes with that in terms of access is that I teach a new media art class where we're looking at contemporary new media artists, and the students are writing blog posts about them. And I let them know that, these artists are out there and they're making work, and they're making work with computers, and they're on the computer as much as you are. And I bet they have a Google alert, and I bet that they're going to know when they wake up one morning and there was 15 blog posts written about them last night. So there's a pretty good chance, I would say, that they're going to read it. And you should be aware that, like, when you're putting something out there, that it can be, and I've never had I don't think that we've ever had an experience in my class of someone finding a piece and an artist and responding, but it has happened before, which is exciting, and then also potentially terrifying to some of the students. So I try and let them know that, that's a possibility. I have a lot more to say, but I think I'm going to hold it for the previous. We can go to the next one.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is that range between professionals, scholars writing blog posts that are for more public consumption, less specialized audiences, versus, again, that massive amount of information that is available through certain great works of literature, like the Brothers Grimm, where you Google that and now it's millions and millions of pages. How do we decide who we should read? Who are these people who are offering a more accessible view, who are experts in offering a more accessible view versus versus just any old person on the web, versus even, and this is an interesting, like the amateur, right? But who is still passionate and knowledgeable about it, the amateur historian, the amateur literature lover, the amateur, all of these kinds of things. And so how we help students and even sometimes ourselves go through that. And that leads actually really nicely into the next question, which is that question of your own personal engagement online with your experience, expertise, those things that you're passionate about. Have you gotten in arguments on Facebook in the comments, or written, I'm looking at you, Will, a particular polemical, no, not on Facebook, but a blog post that does very much react to and comment on stuff that's being said in the news or on social media. And it could be directly in your area of expertise, or it could just be around sort of like fake news, right? That we're all kind of doing that on. Yeah.
I'll jump in and just say that I've had a really different sort of experience this year. My second book came out in January. And yay, yes, woohoo, Mazel tov. And a professor and pastor in New York City got an advance copy of it. And he read it and loved it and posted a video about it on Facebook. And all of a sudden, I started getting friend requests from random people on Facebook. And my Facebook is pretty well shut down, and it's only, friends, family, and coworkers, former students once they graduate. So all of a sudden, I start getting these friend requests, and I start getting notifications on Twitter of new followers. And they were almost all conservative African-American Protestants who were interested in the book because this one professor did this video about it. And it has opened up a different way for me to look at my own work, because it apparently struck a chord with a group of people who believed that I was accurately describing not just what was happening in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, but what's still going on today. And I've had more people comment on my book on places that I didn't expect, like on Amazon, leaving reader reviews. And these are people who aren't in the academy and are critiquing my book in ways that I never thought of, because that wasn't the audience I was thinking about it. So in a strange way, social media helped me think about my book differently. Of course, now that it's published and I can't do anything about it.
This was the next one.
Yes, the next one.
But those other avenues, and that's sort of how it informs one another in those kinds of ways. So it's not so much that this is almost the opposite of the question, which is people you weren't expecting engaged with you on social media versus the other way around, which is that's really actually really fantastic.
Yeah,
that's great. Anyone else?
I think one of the challenges in political science, obviously, is separating passion from expertise. And there's a lot of passion. There's a lot of passion out there, but the expertise is often very lacking. And, helping students navigate. We've been talking in one of my classes a lot about how people seek information. And we tend to like information that agrees with us. So if I find a political commentator that agrees with me, sure, I think that person's very smart because they say the things I'm thinking. They must be smart. But trying to get past that, trying to look for who's making a good argument, thinking about logical fallacies, thinking about people citing appropriate evidence, and these sorts of challenges that cut across the curriculum in a lot of ways, but that really focus on trying to figure out who is saying smart things in commentary and who isn't. And there's a lot of, we've been engaging a lot with smart reporters lately. Political science has a big movement to reach out to journalists, and journalists have been reaching out to us. And trying to find those sorts of people, trying to help them, trying to increase their audience's knowledge, and trying to encourage students to find those types of people, I think, is incredibly important. And teaching them best standards of evidence has been my biggest strategy there, as opposed to reading what feels good.
Since you called me out, Lee, I'm really conflict averse, so I actually don't engage with people on social media about things that I care about. Right? I only talk about things I don't really care about on social media because I don't like conflict. But where I do talk about things that I care about, and that I care about specifically, narrowly in a professional sense, is on my blog, because historians are sort of congenitally unable to be brief. So, I can't even do a Facebook post, let alone, 140 characters about anything I care about. So I need the elbow room that the blog presents. And also, I like to have my space where I can control it, right? And I do, when I write a blog post about something where I'm engaging with a contemporary issue from a position of professional expertise, I do share it on social media, and discussion often then happens on social media of the blog post. But I have to be 1 degree removed from the confrontation, and I really, again, I think it's really hard to say meaningful things in that kind of brief format. And speaking of what responding sort of what Chad was talking about in the questions of expertise, and one thing I think about a lot when I am looking to add my voice to a kind of contemporary conversation in the online space from a position of professional expertise, is to be hyper aware of when I can speak from a position of professional expertise and when I'm just a guy with an opinion, right? And to really only take the time to craft my 300 to 500 word sort of popularly oriented blog post when I think that my perspective as a historian is adding something that's not already being, not already in the conversation. And that's not necessarily narrowly having to do with my scholarly expertise, but a sort of historian's perspective, right? A question of, how something about the current moment can be understood by understanding change over time, right? So in that particular kind of methodological perspective, I think can add something to the conversation, then I'll actually take the time to write a blog post. And if it's just, I have an opinion about something, then I try to hold back and not present myself as an expert in those contexts. Yeah.
That's the same for me. Post only if I'm absolutely sure that I'm right. Otherwise, I'm not really. I just did that yesterday, actually. There was a George Takei post on Facebook. I don't know if anyone has a subscription. It was about a building in northern Germany that was built under the Nazis as barracks. It's like 2.8 mile long building, huge resort. And they are building now apartments there. It was never finished under the Nazis, and there was the discussion, should he build holiday apartments there or not? And I said, wait a minute, they actually did finish it after the war, and it was actually, there was a barracks first of the Soviets and then of the East German army, and actually the people that were there were people like me, namely the people that did not wanted to shoot, but did was what it was called construction soldiers, and those were actually looked upon very lowly, and they were actually treated much worse than other soldiers, than the regular soldiers. And so there is a political history actually here, and it was actually used as barracks. But what do you do with 2.8 8 miles of a building. You know, the Russians tried to blow it up after the war. It didn't work because it was so massively built. So by all means, build those damn apartments, but you know, also keep the little museum that's there and actually reminds people of the history of the place. And that, I think, is a solution. And that's what I wrote there. So it was a little bit lengthy too.
Yeah.
But not 2.8
Yeah.
miles.
So I like to walk towards conflict.
As
Yes.
Half the room is on my Facebook page. What I like to do is a number of things. I like to connect myself with people I'm reading, with other scholars in the field, of different parts of the field. I do mostly work in social studies and social justice. So actually, I'm reading what they're doing and working on, and they're sharing with me and the like. We're communicating with one another. I actually encourage my students to add me on Facebook because a lot of discussions I have impact what's going on in classrooms and schools. So they can see what's going on there, and if they don't have the media literacy, proficiency skills to kind of make sense of some things out of there. I don't really see myself as a vetter per se, but I see myself because I do a lot of work in identity and being white and male and cisgender. And the like, that I use essentially my voice of privilege to challenge and attack privilege. Because I do a lot of work in critical race theory, and part of that is the counter-narrative of marginalized populations and groups. And so that's a space where I lift up other stories of other things that are happening, whether in the news or on video or the like. Sometimes I comment on them. Sometimes, per my privilege, I should just raise them and not talk about it. I just leave it here for people to look at and think about. But I purposely do a lot of that. It's challenging. Sometimes I get pushback, which I'm okay with. Sometimes it's more aggressive or academic than not. But my students have learned a lot from it, kind of what's going on and making sense of what's going on in the world, because they don't know to look to things. And so it's been really productive for a lot of my students to make sense of a lot of what's going on.
I've written a lot of comments on social media and then immediately deleted them.
The delete button is fantastic.
It feels good to get it out and then not be a part of the conversation. But or sometimes I don't even send them, I just write them. But I encourage my students. I think one of the really great things about social media is specifically Instagram. That's the one that I really like as it relates to contemporary art, because there's a lot of artists that have Instagrams, and they use them and Tumblr too, and they use them in so many different ways. And there's people that, and it's a level, and like I said before, like it's a level of access that probably never existed before, where there's some people that they use their Instagram or their Tumblr to put out like sketches, or you're looking at works in progress, or there's some people, their entire art practice exists only on their social media. There's people that their work, they're in the gallery, but their work like primarily exists on Instagram, and that's really exciting to see that sort of work evolve, and then also that you have this access and your ability to look at it and a lot of the times interact with them, which is a positive, I think, spin on commenting on things on the internet and being able to talk to people directly. But then also sometimes it's just regular stuff like pictures of food and their animals or whatever, which is also a neat perspective and way to look at someone when previously they would just be a picture hanging in a gallery, but now you can know what their dog looks like or whatever.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Jason, about that? Because one of the lessons I really internalized from working with Domain of One's Own here, right, is that anything you produce on social media you don't ultimately own, right? Anything you contribute to Facebook, right? And which is why when I when I want to write something more substantial for public consumption, I try to do it on my own blog and then link to it on social media, right? So that I can get the exposure, but like it's still there and it's archived and I still own it and control it and can keep it, right? And I'm wondering if there's discussions about that in your field at all, right? Of people who are producing, whose like medium is social media, right? Do the questions of ownership and sort of come up either like in the field more broadly or in your work with your students?
I think that if you are putting something on the internet, you have to be prepared for it to be stolen.
It's not about stolen, it's about it disappearing, right? You losing access to it, right?
What do you mean?
Like if Instagram goes out of business, then your body
Oh,
of work disappears.
Sure,
Right?
yeah.
I guess I'm wondering if that's something that right.
Doesn't concern.
I don't mean ownership like being stolen. I mean
Yeah,
ownership
it's-
like
It's sort of okay.
like if you use social media as your medium, right? Like your ability to hang on to that work and even have it for yourself in the future is actually really not in your hands, you know?
Yeah, you got to back your stuff up.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Is that a conversation in your field?
Well, yeah, sure, and then I mean that's a very real concern. There's tons of people. There's like a whole generation of young millionaires who built their wealth on the app Vine. And then one day they were like,
Vine's a
okay,
great
Vine doesn't
example.
exist anymore. And now they're all on YouTube or Instagram or whatever. And like there's always going to be the next thing. But yeah, that's very real. Like the people that their entire social media, and they had tons and tons of work, you know, based around this one program. And then one day they decided it doesn't exist anymore. You've got, you know, a month to get your stuff off, you know, and figure out, you know, reinvent yourself. But yeah, that is definitely, I think, a concern. With all kinds of technology, I use a digital picture frame that connects to the internet, and you upload your videos onto the frame. And then one day I got an email that they said, we're selling the company and we're not supporting you anymore. You know, so sorry about all of your stuff. You're gonna have to find a new one. So yeah, that's always a concern for sure.
That's something we wrestle with over in library land a lot. Is how are we going to capture this scholarly record that you all are creating and make it part of the ongoing scholarly conversation so that it's there 50 years from now when somebody is going to come study Jason's work because, you know, he's the preeminent digital artist of the century.
I like the way you think.
So how do we as the librarians, as the custodians, if you will, of the scholarly record, how do we capture that? How do we preserve that? How do we make it discoverable for the future?
This is a big thing in history too, right? How do you work? I mean, I do
Archives,
19th century history, so not for me, but for people who do more contemporary work, right? How can you count on a reliable archive for born digital objects, right? Yeah.
I don't have an answer yet.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone does.
I think there's
Media alone, yeah.
there's a conference I think happening every weekend where people discuss this stuff. This is, you know.
I was at one last weekend.
Yeah.
We were talking about that. Liberal arts colleges. How are we going to preserve all this stuff? Digital
Yes,
scholarship.
absolutely.
Wait till I talk to you about our institutional repository, but that'll be next week.
Hooray! Well, and that actually leads really nicely in as well to the next question is like, how do we help students negotiate with all of this when we're asking them to create their own digital scholarship online, but even when we're helping them navigate being political scientists or artists or educators, historians online? How are we, you know, how do you really have these conversations with your students and, you know, help them, because we found very different approaches throughout all of your answers for this. And so how do we help students figure out their own answers to these very same questions that we're grappling with as professionals, as experts, quote unquote, in our fields, and as our students are hopefully working to become more expert in their chosen field?
I think there's an interesting journey that a lot of students take when they're here. You see a lot of freshmen come on with their social media and, you know, old man Murphy, I'm going to post whatever I want. You can't stop me. Every picture has to have a red Solo cup in it. Every picture has to be, you know, wildly inappropriate. And then so around their sophomore year, they lock it down. They go, uh-oh, people are starting to see these things. Maybe I should hide it. But the next step, and one thing I think especially Domain of One's Own has done here at UMW, and what I really try to do is teach students, okay, but how can you create a positive image on the internet? It's not just about not embarrassing yourself. It's, we can take that one step further and we can build something.
Control the narrative.
And I've done a number of independent studies with students where they have, I did one with a young woman who had a blog. And we spent the semester learning how to best promote her blog. And we looked at doing regular posts on the blog. We looked at connecting with other people on blogs. We looked at connecting on Reddit. We looked at Instagram, social media, Twitter, all these different ways. And using that info I learned from the students who do the independent studies, then taking them to other students, taking them to the classroom, showing them, look, it's not just about hiding negative things. It's about building. When someone Googles you, the first thing they're going to find is your blog, what you want them to see, your website, your portfolio for art students, things like that. Navigating those sorts of things. In political science, we have the added challenge of your political ideology being a thing. So you have to, and it's a challenge for students at 19, 20 thinking, where do I want to be? What kinds of jobs I'll be looking for in 10, 15, 20 years, starting that path? Do I want to be an anarcho-capitalist who wants to overthrow the system and take it all down, and then you go try to work for like a mainstream Republican someday, and it's not going to go well, unfortunately. Do you want, I certainly want, I'll put myself out there, my bad political thoughts at 19 being used today for anything. And thinking about these ideas and how do you want to represent yourself? How do you want to represent yourself in 5, 10, 15 years? And really working with them sort of plan that digital identity and craft it. And it's every student is different, and trying to find their paths, trying to work with them is really interesting.
I'll just chime in and say that I've, in one particular class, used the scared straight method. In terms of getting students to understand what happens to their digital productions. I teach a course called Sex, Gender, and Religion in America, and I started it. It was a team-taught course, Kristen Moon in History and American Studies, and I did this together, and I've taken it over as a course I teach myself. And they blog for this course. And we read all sorts of NSFW work, things that you probably don't want to admit in a job interview you ever read. We read about Puritans and their relationships with their livestock, for example. And we read about gay Orthodox Jews. And we read about all sorts of things, and they have to blog about it. It's also a speaking intensive course. And so they have to do a 5-minute presentation at the end of the semester that they record and get to me. And I've been spending a lot of time explaining to them every time I teach this class, 1, don't use your name on the blog, okay, because you're going to be reacting to some very touchy subjects, and you don't want your name attached to that because someday somebody's going to Google you, and they're going to find this blog post, and they won't be as understanding as maybe, actually one student told me last semester, I didn't even tell my mom I'm taking this class. So if mom doesn't know you're taking the class, you don't want random people on the internet. And I've also tried to get them to use a private channel on YouTube to record their video to make it available to me, because you don't want that discoverable either. And even and now that I've opened it up to more creative presentations, which do not get as creative as you might think, don't worry, but you still don't want that associated with your name. Now, I've only been doing this for a few years, so I don't know if I've scared them yet, and if this isn't going to come back and bite them in 5 to 10 years. But I am very cognizant of the fact that what we're doing in my classroom would not fly in an interview, that you've written about this.
Well, and that also comes back to that question of preservation, and asking that question, what is it that we do actually want to preserve? What needs to be preserved? Yes. And what just needs to go away the way it used to, where a paper sat in a box in the bottom of a closet where only the student and the teacher. It's great that we have public scholarship and have these opportunities, but there's also assumption if you had taught that class 20 years ago, nobody would ever see that paper, nobody would ever see that presentation, and we were all okay with that, right? Yes. So there's these twin sort of forces saying, yes, we want to preserve the scholarship, but then we also, sometimes we want things that just go away, that it's 15 weeks and we carry some stuff with us, but those traces should just evaporate. So how do we negotiate those kinds of things? But yeah, that brings up a really good question around that too. Go ahead, sorry.
So being a K-12 teacher is a political act. In terms of, though we teach knowledge and skills, it's where our attitudes, dispositions, perceptions come into play, And so does where those things rely or live in social media, especially during increasingly political and controversial times, how we think about things. And so there is the appropriate part that we talk to our students. And luckily, our program starts typically with second semester freshmen and sophomores, so we get them earlier. They may have done domain and unknown the freshman year or the like, but we get them, and we have a very serious conversation about them with what's online about them. From the first class in our program, they're going to be out in schools for 20 hours working with local kids. And part of this really difficult conversation is they're going to go into their practicum placement, and within the first day, they're going to be the coolest new person in the life of an 8-year-old. And that 8-year-old who can Google will go find you. And whatever they find, whether they like and reinforces what they just learned about you, to what degree they've learned it, or upsets them, goes to typically not their parent first. It goes to all their friends first, the photos they find about you at parties or whatever you may be doing. Then at some point it goes to a parent finds out, it goes to the school board, it goes to the college, and we have to pull you. And so the conversations we have to have about scrubbing your digital identity from the very beginning and going back 2 years. We literally have you go back with your friends, go back through all your photos, all your statements. To what degree did you write this summer or this past year going into your student teaching would be deemed by some local parents un-American in terms of attacking a political figure. You know, anything that's controversial can have you removed from the classroom. As a student in the program or an in-source teacher, we have no protections. And so the First Amendment and free speech for teaching is really difficult because there's this fine line you have to walk, and often, at least with our students in our programs, you can't say exactly what you want to say. Not so much to worry about us, but how the public reacts, how parents react, how principals react, because all principals, everyone in schools is political in some stance. Everything we see, whether it's Ferguson or Charlottesville, it has reflections of the families and their beliefs about things, and whatever they find about you or what you believe, you know, to what degree teachers are making their students stand, put their hand on their heart, or they have to say the pledge to a degree that's unconstitutional or not. Doesn't matter to some, and your belief in that, you know, online or in person matters. So part of it is the solo cup issue, which is like, we got to scrub stuff. You know, anything that upsets a kid, it doesn't matter if you're of age, it doesn't matter if it's in public, it doesn't matter if you're responsible when it happened. If it upsets a child, that's a problem. Going forward, this can happen to you at any time. Someone can find anything you have at any time from your past and can challenge you because we have a morality clause in our contracts, which is the last part, which is we can get rid of you for any ethical or moral reason, okay, which you have no protection for. We don't have tenure in that sense in K-12. And so it creates some anxiety when our students come into the program, and it should. But this is a part when we tell them you need to be responsible for who you are. You need to go backwards. What is your messaging? What is your imaging? And for some, which is difficult, we have that conversation, which is you're not going to untag yourself because that still exists. You got to have difficult conversations with people. Your family members, your friends, that needs to come down, whatever that is. Even because, and you don't, that's the hardest thing, they don't know what's on there about them. To whatever degree they've been doing stuff for years and taking photos of stuff for years and documenting whatever parties or fun acts they've had. And so it's this constant tension in our field, whether you're in a teacher ed program or you're in the field, of is what I just said about the president too much? Is my support of this new movement too much? And what happens when a parent challenges that or a principal challenges that? So for us, it becomes really controversial, really, you know, becomes a lot of ethical decisions, and there's a lot of constraint teachers have to make sense of, especially because they may think everyone has the same political views as they do, and they don't, or the same cultural, ethnic orientation background they do, and they don't. And so they find themselves as an island in a situation in which they're in trouble, and they did not think they would be in. And that's the difficult part on being on a college campus in which they have more progressive ideas on campus. But beyond the borders of this institution, looking at other local schools, we don't. We're still in the South. We still have Confederate flags on our lawns. And so making sense of the contentiousness of all these things is really difficult for young people, specifically if they're not from right here in our region. And so they have to make sense of that. And it's a challenging thing for them as a 19-year-old, let alone a 23-year-old, to go, I need to scrub part of my life, and to what degree I think I should, but in the field you're going into, you have to.
So this question, I want to say, has actually led me in the classroom in some some sort of traditional directions, I should say, which is that I have found that I address the question of helping students engage online, not so much by talking about technology or social media or any of that stuff more explicitly. It's really shaped the way I teach writing, and particularly it's made me much more conscious about teaching students to write in different voices. For different audiences, right, and having conversations with students about how you write for different audiences. And so increasingly, particularly in my upper level classes, not so much in introductory level classes, if I have students do a research paper, I actually make them do a kind of classic college paper for me, where I ask them to write it in the most academic terms that they can. And then I actually make them essentially do a new version of the same material for the web, right? Whether it's sometimes, if it's a class with a coherent topic, I'll create a website where they're all contributing to. Sometimes if they're off doing research projects on their own, I'll have them put it on their own domain of one's own site. And it's basically, I'm asking them to talk about the same historical topic using the same sources, achieving the same analyses, but for a different audience, for a public audience. And so I think that this question of teaching students to engage online has really, I don't tend to get much into the questions of technology or the sort of ethical uses of social media. I'm like, okay, when you're going to write online, you need to learn, you need to imagine who your audience is, and that me as a professor, right, as a professional in the subject is going to be a very different audience from whoever you're going to be writing for in a digital space. So let's talk about how you actually write on the sentence level, right, for different audiences. And I talk to them about that as kind of building a muscle, right, the ability to write in a way that not only clearly expresses your ideas, but is pitched for a particular imagined audience. And so that's really, and that was entirely a product of my thinking about having students engage online, right? I hadn't really thought about teaching them to write in different voices before, because all the writing they did was for me, right? And now that the digital technology has given me an opportunity to have students write for an audience beyond me, I've found that makes me address question of voice and audience in the way I teach writing much more explicitly.
I love that. I used to teach freshman writing way back, and one of the things that I got students thinking about around voice, and this was before, was like, describe your weekend as you would to your best friend. Now describe the weekend as you would to your grandmother.
Yeah. Yeah.
How is it different? and that also gets them thinking that they already instinctly, in a lot of cases, use different voices and different registers depending on who their audience is in their everyday interactions. And then you're taking it that next step, which I love, is like, okay, now let's do that exact same exercise for.
Well, and I do it in that I actually tend to do it in the order that I outlined it, right? I actually have them write academically for me first, and then at the end of the semester they write digitally, because I want to kind of challenge their hierarchy, because I think they often come in having been taught by their entire schooling experience that academic writing is kind of the pinnacle of writing, right? And the writing that you do for your friends, right, on whatever social media they use now, right? Or the writing that you would do in an email to your grandmother, right, is like a lesser kind of writing than the writing that you do for a professor. And I actually specifically make them write academically first, and then ask them to write for a more popular audience second, to try to challenge that notion that academic writing is the pinnacle of writing. I try to make the point that no, it's just one particular kind of writing, and that you need to be able to do that, and then actually stepping back from that academic writing and pulling out jargon and pulling out specialized terms and articulating yourself for a sort of an educated layperson is actually in some cases a lot more challenging than allowing yourself the full luxury of specialist jargon for someone like me who knows the specialist jargon, right?
So you guys actually, in your answers, covered a lot of the other questions. So I'll leave this open now to say if you guys have anything that you want to add around these questions, particularly around, and again, we sort of talked about it, what you were saying around public scholarship, right? From the sounds of it, we're all practicing it in some kind of way, right? And we're asking our students to engage in it in various ways and on various levels. And what is our responsibility, do you think, to engage ourselves, to also teach these sorts of skills, particularly within a liberal arts environment? But maybe even just being an educator in 2017.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about these issues of, both, and I confront these issues with myself, and then how do I want to teach my students? What do I want them to be? And thinking about, how that varies for students of different genders, different races, things like that, how, challenges you face. And we talked earlier about the idea of overreaching, and academics with the idea of, I only want, as a couple people said, I only want to speak when it's something I can add value to as an academic. Otherwise, I'm using my credentials. No one said this, but almost fraudulently. Like, I have a PhD, I study the following things. I study American politics. My commentary on international relations are not PhD level comments. They're YouTube commenter level comments. And so, trying to think about not overreaching while, simultaneously there's incentives to put yourself out there, and the more things you comment on, and in a way, the more controversial things you say, the more attention you get, the more followers you get, maybe the more job opportunities that come your way. Or not,
Or
maybe.
not. But there's also a risk there, and I've seen this in religious studies with public scholarship, where religious studies scholars, historians of American religious history will make statements, post on blogs, and get just eviscerated by people who don't want what they're saying. And the big topic these days is the history of the religion of the Founding Fathers. It's been contentious for quite some time now. And there are a number of historians who have written about the history, or about the religion of the Founding Fathers, using historical sources, historical methods, and we perceive those as very sound sources. There are some quasi-amateur historians who have written with a particular agenda in mind, and that is to make the Founding Fathers all good, God-fearing Christians. They're all like Patrick Henry. None of them are, the way they write it, Thomas Jefferson was Patrick Henry and religious and devout, and George Washington was clearly going to church every day. And they turn the documents that they have at their disposal and amplify certain parts of them and sell this in a popular setting to people who want to believe that the Founding Fathers, each and every last one of them, was a good Christian. And their followers have attacked these folks on social media in various really nasty ways. And the concern is for some of the historians who write, one is, now my email is flooded, my Twitter mentions are off the charts, but there are some, and I'm thinking of a particular historian, Kelly Baker, who's a historian of the Klan, who gets death threats, right? For what she does. And she is not attached to a particular university. She is a writer and a scholar, but there are other people who get these threats and worry that their institution will not protect them, sort of like John's student teachers. And this is something that really people are asking themselves, is it worth my getting out there as a public historian if I'm going to get attacked like that, and if my institution won't have my back when it happens?
Yeah, there's a lot going on right now in medieval studies around this very thing right now, with scholars of disability and race in medievalism, and challenging the notion that the medieval was this glorious white time, or and then being very much attacked and doxxed and getting all of these kinds of threats for it. So that's we're seeing it happening more and more now, and so that's another consideration when we're talking to our students, right? Their safety, right? What's the safety?
I think there are two things. So addressing what you're saying with hate mail. So most of my research recently is teachers' perceptions and the teaching of racial events like Ferguson and Black Lives Matter movements and the like. And that's the first time I've received hate mail as a professor, which my colleague and I at Arkansas have received a fair amount of hate mail from people, and why are we looking at this, to what degree are we looking at this, and I consider this safety. But in a lot of critical studies, when you get hate mail, it means you're doing it right. Because you're changing narratives and making people think, and people are uncomfortable, and so that's part of it. So maybe I should have been thinking about my safety, but haven't. And the approach with the public scholar in the social media aspect, I think I take a different approach. I think of myself first as the high school government teacher who wish I had access to all these things, to show my students all these things, and things I talked about in class I can show you now examples of, and videos and research with. And so I think more, because my background in civic education, as just a citizen first, which like ethically or morally, or as humans, we need to talk about these issues. Or when things are swaying because we have very short attention spans to other issues, we need to go back to the others that are really important right now that we're forgetting about.
2 days. What was it? It's 2 days now we have before it spikes and then it's gone out of our consciousness. They've measured it and it's a fairly consistent spike, particularly on social media, at about like 52 hours and then it's gone.
So I mean, currently, like I bring a lot back right now to Puerto Rico, when issues in Puerto Rico, and because quickly we forget about things, and whether other citizens alike in terms of political issues, civic issues, make sense of it. I look at it as a citizen for people who are going to voting for whichever way they're going to vote, for which I want them to be informed that they are really important things we're not keeping in the front of our minds. We need to.
That, of course, would mean that you are a citizen. So, and what about people whose political expertise actually brings them in conflict with the state, who has actually the right to control their being here or not? So, that
I'm
aspect
not
as well.
an American citizen either. That's something that I wrestle with too, and particularly also with undocumented students, dreamer students, students who are here illegally. As much as I hate using that word, but that's how the government has decided to label them, and so we're asking them, right? But then that also becomes that question of expertise as well. Like, what expertise does somebody who is embodying that position bring into the situation too, that typically isn't respected, taken as seriously by the academy, right? So what can we talk about? I think your example of East Germany is a good one of that too. That's a very situated, personal expertise but it is, right? And I'm often asked, my area is comparative literature, but I'm growing up in Quebec and growing up during, referendums and those kinds of things around separatism. I bring a certain expertise to it, not to say that I'm an expert and studied the history, but I lived it, right? So what kind of insider information can some of us bring sometimes, and can our students bring sometimes, and how do we help them negotiate that as well, to be like, to help them move the argument beyond this is just my lived opinion, but to like this is grounded in reality, but also the reality of many, many other people who are experiencing it at the same time.
So this is something that I have addressed in our department's methodology class, and in a way that I'm not at all going to claim was successful, right? But it's it's led, I think, my conversations in some very epistemological directions, right? About how do we have communities of knowledge, right? How do we validate truth claims? What's an academic truth claim versus a biographical truth claim, right? And again, I don't claim this is successful because I think that sometimes I get too abstract too quickly. Right, when I try to teach how to do scholarly research using digital sources, right? I love having our library colleagues, right? Because they get very concrete, whereas I'm like, how do we know something's an academic source? Let's talk about communities that respect truth claims, right? And I think that's not at all what the students need. But
tell me what I should be reading. Just tell me what I should read, okay?
No, they'll be like, an academic source has footnotes, right? And I'm like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to say, right? But I think that and I think that is a question with digital engagement, both pedagogically and as scholars, right? And to speak, to sort of reflect back on what Chad and Mary Beth were talking about, right? How do we, exercise our own epistemological modesty in digital environments, right? Understand where we can make claims and where we can't, right? And then it's something that I think we have to teach students on the other side too, right? Which is that, I find it unuseful to divide the internet into things that are true and are untrue, right? I'd rather, basically because I think that doesn't teach them how to do it themselves, right? That's just me telling them that some things are true and some things are not true. I try instead to have conversations about okay, what kinds of truth claims underlie this thing, and are they ones that we want to participate in or not, right? As academics, as citizens, right, as human beings or whatever, right? And again, like I said, I'm not sure that's actually a successful pedagogical strategy. And maybe my goal is to plant a seed that will then bloom in a decade, right? But I think that engaging students in the classroom with both research and communication of their work online, to my mind, really leads to these kinds of conversations about how do we structure knowledge, right?
And one of the best parts about being at a liberal arts college is, working with these students individually. All these students have different needs, different goals. I mean, we talked about poli-sci. There's either the go big or go home. I'm going to say inflammatory things on the internet and get 50,000 followers, and 25,000 are hate followers. Or do you want to be more conservative with your approach? Those things differ for, women get a lot more aggressive hate mail on the internet. It's people of color. Talking about undocumented students, do you really want to put yourself out there that much? And, being able to work with individual students, think about who they are, what they want, what their goals are, and helping them anticipate the consequences. I'll speak for myself. At 20, I wasn't great at understanding consequences of things when I would turn,
Hands up, who was at 20?
Yes.
Not you.
Anyone?
So helping them try to anticipate those consequences, building the trust that they believe me of the consequences, unlike what I did with my professors when I was young. And it's trying to work with them individually and see those kinds of things. What do you want to do with your digital identity? And I think that's one of the best things we can do here, is help them figure out who they want to be and how they want to interact with the world.
Jason, you've been quiet. I want to give you space to speak.
I feel like sort of a lot of my experiences and ideas relating to these things are majorly changing the subject. But I guess
That's why I invited you.
Yeah. I think going back to some of the things we were talking about earlier, one of the things that I'm most excited about is in terms of social media and this access is what I sort of keep coming back to, is this ability to break down a lot of the traditional barriers that were there previously in terms of being able, like, learning how to do things, like deciding, like, there's so often when I read something, like, I really like hip hop, and where I read something where, like, an interview with someone who's like a successful new rapper, and they're like, oh, I got really interested in learning how to rap in 2016, or whatever, and they, or like that, maybe that's a exaggeration, 2015, and then they're like,
so long ago,
and then they're like, so you download the program, and then you learn the tutorials, and like all this information's there, and there's all these people that are sharing their expertise, and that's what I always try, and then you can do it, and then not only can you learn how to do it and then do it, then there's these communities that you can join and share your work and the things that you make, and that's something that I'm always really excited about and trying to stress to my students, like, all of this information is out there, and like there's these things, like, because I teach programs, and there's only so much time that, like, I can teach you After Effects, but I can sort of get the ball rolling, and then you can look at it and say, oh, and if you want to become amazing at this, there's so many other people out there who's like I can recommend a really good 16-hour tutorial for you, like, if you really want to sit down with it, and that there's just unlimited amounts of not only knowledge out there to consume information, but then also ways of then sharing, then all these other equally exciting ways of sharing it with people, and having, and so that you're not just there's like this kind of, like, especially in music, but also in contemporary art, this idea of like the sort of undiscovered, like, bedroom artist or whatever, who's like making the work because they want to, and then but there's like, how do I show it? And that doesn't really exist anymore. It's like there's all of these opportunities to get that stuff out there, which I think is really exciting.
That brings it around too, is as we were saying about this sort of hashtag activism around Ferguson, around Black Lives Matter. I mean, these are conversations that are more in the mainstream and that we're having increasingly, not just locally, but nationally and even internationally, because of social media, right? Because of these commercial platforms that are mining our data and making profits on them. But at the same time, people are able to share their work, people are able to share their ideas, and people are able to create community and get entire movements going, right? Change the direction of political discourse in both positive and negative ways. But certainly, I was following Ferguson on Twitter, as 3 days before CNN picked it up, 3 or 4 days before New York Times was talking about it. And so just being able to have that access to information, to what's going on, to ideas. On the flip side of that as well, I was at a conference this weekend and showing the graph of big data of social media, and showed a sort of heat map of where tweets were coming from. And there's Syria, that's completely dark, right? And we know that things are going on in Syria, and yet, in this particular case, the revolution is not, or the genocide is not being tweeted. It's not being covered in that particular area because of just access and blackouts and government censorship. So, it's both of those things where there's these amazing opportunities, and then there's also looking at it and saying, okay, well, what isn't being broadcast yet still? So.
I should say it has also pushed for me in the opposite, in much more of a hyper-local direction for me, my digital engagement compared to, I think moments like Ferguson and, tend to pull students here that exist in this particular time of place into a national conversation, and I think that's really good and important. But one thing it has done for me as a public historian has pulled me into the local. I'm not a Fredericksburg native, right? I have no roots here before I got this job, right? But my engagement with social media has actually led me to engage with hyper-local issues about particularly things like affordable housing and memorialization and things like that that affect this area in a very local sense in a way that I think I'm not sure I would have otherwise, right? Because my scholarly concerns are not linked to the place I live inherently. So I think that one of the interesting things that social media can do for us and for our students is pull us in both those directions, right? They can make everything national. They can make, they can engage the entire country in the specific political dynamics of suburban St. Louis. They can also take a community of scholars and students who are not necessarily from here and engage them in this place for the time that we're here in a way that I think without that digital form, I'm not sure I would have been in the place, but considerably less of the place, I think.
Yeah, and helping students understand the power of small groups that you can only find on the internet, whether it's Black Lives Matter organizing there, things like the Arab Spring, Trump voters organizing there. And not even political spaces, whether it's trying to find ways to learn how to use, Photoshop or whatever. Trying to find, for my students, if they want to learn more, I give them a couple introductory methods courses on statistics, but if you want to get good at this stuff, if you want to get good at programming, well, here's places you can do it. You can go on Stack Exchange, you can go on Reddit, you can go, if you just want to find a community of people like you in whatever way that is, finding everything that's out there and finding whether it's your local community and learning things about Fredericksburg or learning things about software or some specific politician or whatever you're doing. Seeking out all these things, creating identity in those groups, exploring those groups, learning all the different powers those things have, I think is important. And one of the things we can really encourage students to do at a liberal arts college.
I think a thing I've been doing more recently as students in the university have added me online, and some of us online, is I've had a lot of conversations with online digital groups or professors of allowing students into the groups. That we have all these conversations and we have students with lots of questions or interests. They don't know how to do things. They want to know how. And they're waiting for us to publish something, or they're waiting for us to forward something that doesn't exist yet while we have some of these conversations. And often we have stuff to add. So for example, recently with those cities and states that are moving or going away from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day is, so how do I do it? Or how do I begin to have that conversation with my students about it, knowing that the way my state has done it is not correct, or what we call people is not correct. And so there have been more elementary social studies places and secondary places where they can go talk to other professors on the stuff they're working on right now, and they're trying in their methods classes. And it's one way that they can have conversations with other people that are not me, because I don't know that yet. But so making those connections for them, and they're joining other groups and they're adding stuff online, and they're part of the discussion as professors and other academics and professionals make sense of it.
think I'll open it up to the floor for questions for the last couple of minutes, unless anyone.
Okay, I have a comment and then a question. My first comment is, so I was in one of Will's classes where we did that, writing academically and then on a blog post. And that actually came in handy. I didn't know then, of course. So I was like
I didn't either, if it makes you
semester,
feel any better.
senior year, you know, like, wasn't paying attention. But yesterday it came in handy. I spent an hour on a Facebook comment, an hour, and it's because this girl, but she keeps making her posts friends only and then public, and she flips it back and forth, and I'm like, oh boy, if this is public, I really have to make sure like I'm saying exactly what I want to say in ways that people won't attack me and things like that. And do I even want to engage in this thread? Of course I do, because it's entertaining. But that's just me. But yeah, so that came in handy a lot. So I actually really appreciate that.
I think yours was the first time I did that, the class you were in, maybe. So I'm glad it worked, at least to some level. Yeah.
What was that waiting period we were talking about?
Yeah.
You're planting the seed.
Totally, yeah.
There you go. It's like, it's
Yeah.
2 years. Yeah, exactly.
Delayed gratification. I appreciate that. Yeah.
And then my question for everyone is, I've witnessed it, so I'm wondering if you witnessed it and have you been this person where on different social media platforms you see a post or a thread that's not so accurate, kind of getting out of hand. Have you ever stepped in and been like, whoa, now, this is my expertise, I study this, I research this, here's what's up. Like, this is what's going on, or this is the accuracy of this, or something like that. So for example, I've seen it on Facebook, but I've mostly happened to see it on Reddit because I go into the nicer areas. Like on our Ask Science or something like that. Like real scientists are explaining things. I don't understand it most of the time, but I'm like, wow, this is really cool. I get to hear, lots of information from these people that work in these fields. So have you seen your colleagues doing that, or have you been that person? And also, if you haven't been, why not? Sorry.
Well, I can definitely answer that second half. Right. Because I think it super depends on the context, right? Like if it's a board about science in which legitimately interested amateurs want scientists to explain to them, right? Then that's an invitation to expertise. And so I think that makes perfect sense. I think there's lots of times when in online culture, a claim of expertise is actually counterproductive, right? And this is something I've been thinking about recently because I have convened a group of faculty on campus who are interested in questions of public history and memorialization to be a reactive force when issues like Charlottesville happen again, right? And one thing we've been talking about is, right, then, so what do we do as a working group on questions of public history and memorialization in Fredericksburg? And we were like, we don't say anything, right? We don't put ourselves out there in those terms, right? Because it's one of those, I think, issues where speaking from a position of expertise is just going to dig in heels on lots of sides, right? And so I think that there's often a really strong case to be made not to make those claims to expertise, right? Because I think that there it is often in a lot of corners of the internet a culture of resistance to expertise, right? And I think that you can often take a pose of non-expertise and perhaps lead a comment thread in a direction more effectively than if you come in and say, no, I'm the expert on this issue and here's what's up.
Yeah.
Right? I think that doesn't really work.
And I'll jump in and say that I'm of two minds in this. There's been a recent debate both on Facebook and Twitter among religious historians, so historians of religion, not necessarily religious people, although they're part of this debate too. There was a Senate confirmation hearing, and I'm forgetting the name of the confirmee, the nominee, but Dianne Feinstein and some other Democrats on the panel asked about the nominee's religion. And people who were of this person's religion got very upset on the internet and said, there's no religious test for public office in the Constitution. You can't ask about religion. And a number of other people came back and said, yes, you can, because it informs policy decisions. a whole bunch of people who do the history of religion got into their own flame war about that, with a number of them saying, this is exactly the way people have treated Catholics in the past, for example, and these actually all happen to be evangelical Christians who are saying this, and a number of other people saying, no, this applies to public policy. In that case, I just stayed out of it because these were people who I would have been punching above my weight in this one. These are people who've published more than I have, who probably have a much longer CV than I have, and I wasn't going to add anything to that. But I also feel the acutely that expertise doesn't always matter in these debates. And I actually have an example of something that was a face-to-face interaction that kind of shows this. I have a intro class, and one of the requirements is to come in and meet the professor. Talk to me for 5 minutes. 5% of your grade can be 100% or it can be a 0. That's all you have to do. You can talk to me about anything. The Simpsons, the weather, you could talk to me about something completely off topic. Somebody asked me yesterday why should they be taking Latin or Spanish. We had a discussion about Latin or Spanish, right? But one student came in and said, you told us that, he said, how can you believe that Christians and Muslims worship the same God? And how am I going to answer that? I mean, my expertise in religious studies says, I can tell you I have a PhD in religious studies and I can explain all this, but because he had a faith claim that he was operating from, no matter what I said, it wasn't going to matter.
Can I give you an example of this that actually so I recently wrote a post on my blog. For those of you online who are not in Fredericksburg, it's recently been a very hot political issue in the city about the question of the slave auction block, right? Whether it should be removed, should it be contextualized, right? And it's something I actually have some pretty strong professional opinions about, right? I have a pretty strong professional opinion that sort of contemporary Americans allow themselves not to engage with the full horror of slavery, right? And that I have a deep professional investment in confronting particularly white Americans in the 21st century, right? I mean, they all sort of know generally that slavery was a bad thing, right? No, let's talk about really what that's like, right? And so I have a deep professional investment in that object staying there in some way because of how it furthers that professional aim. But, that's actually not going to be, I didn't think that was a particularly useful argument to make in public, right? So what I wrote about was okay, what happens if you talk about this as an artifact instead of a monument, right? It's not actually a monument, right? It's like something left over. It's an artifact. That's a different thing. Let's talk about, and I think that that's a way where, rather than sort of coming in from a position of, here's my professional expertise. In my professional opinion, it needs to stay and be contextualized in this particular way. I think that, I was able to spark better conversations by saying okay, well, how does your thinking about this issue change if you regard this as an artifact, as an artifact rather than some kind of monument, right? I think people were sort of confusing it with statues of Robert E. Lee, right? And I think that was one of those things where it's stepping back a little bit from deploying the full strength of my professional expertise as was probably the better part of valor, right?
Yeah, I think, in politics, obviously, people are going to think what they're going to think. And there's two ways academics have done this. The first way is to engage with people in political fights. They go on, they post, no, that's not true, here's the research showing it, and those sorts of things. And, that some people enjoy that. I'm with Will, I'm too risk averse and conflict averse to do these sorts of things. I don't have the energy. Another way, though, is I talk to a lot of reporters behind the scenes, give them background info. They'll ask me for sort of contextual questions of, hey, has this ever happened before? What do you think about this? Does this fit a pattern that we're talking about? These sorts of broader questions. Talk to practitioners about what is the research. I was talking to somebody the other day about, are the Democrats going to take back the House? What does political science research say about this? And it was a fairly high up person in the Democratic Party speaking to me, and I'm, okay, I'll give you that info. And then the hope is that shapes the debate in a small sort of way, but maybe among a lot of people. if you can talk to reporters, you can talk to people in the industry, it's a much smaller influence, but maybe it has a ripple effect where then eventually social media will adopt these things and look better. For me, it's just my preferred way. It's a little easier. It's a one-on-one conversation. People aren't jumping in. These are private emails as opposed to public Facebook posts or public Twitter posts, things like that. But there's, again, a number of different strategies in poli-sci. It just kind of depends on what you want to do and how your style, what people enjoy doing.
So I do the other style.
That wasn't on purpose. You just all just happen to sit on opposite sides of the
Because
table.
I
stay away from
want
John.
the public civic discourse and deliberation and compromise or walking away from situations. And to your question, I only do Facebook because I don't understand Reddit. I don't understand Twitter. So I just stick with Facebook. It depends on the situation. I mean, I do a lot of work in identity for which I am not that identity. And so it's not my place to mansplain or white-splain, or just my job is to listen or just back out. Some of it is I have deliberation arguments with people who are much more prestigious than I am. And so it's kind of like my positionality just to kind of back out a little bit, and it is what it is. I am, as most you know, very passionate about what I talk about or post and do, and sometimes I edit a lot what that comment is. Sometimes I delete it a lot. What I've done more recently is gone back to just posing a question back to them and not telling them what the answer is, to kind of lure them. I've had a lot of contention of understandings of equity versus equality in life, and we've talked a lot about online or in classes about the idea of the American dream. Is it accessible to everyone? And we look at a lot of statistics and and some people, we challenge each other and push issues, which is good. But I'd like to redirect. And sometimes, like recently, there's more discussion, or there's always been discussion. 19 states still do corporate punishment in schools, so you can hit kids. And recently, there was the video of the Iowa, essentially kind of like jail within the classroom made out of plywood, which exists all over the country in these states, and whether or not corporal punishment works. Well, there's an emotional issue with that, and a lot of people are like, yeah, I was hit, it works, and anything. Well, that's an N of 1. And for me, who teaches behavioral management within K-12 classrooms, kind of like, well, here's the research. So it may have worked for you, but this is what's happening out there. We can continue this conversation, but statistically, per empirical research from the 70s, it does not work. And so there's that I challenge, but I try to do more questions now than just go full people. So, but every single post is different, so it really depends.
Any other questions before we wrap up? Good. Thank you so much. That was a really great discussion. I think it was really interesting and really got exactly what I'd hoped for in terms of a broad numbers of opinions and different ways we approach it in our classrooms and with our students and according to our disciplines, because I think that positionality is so important. But ultimately, I really feel that it's our students who benefit from all of this, because clearly they're getting really great guidance and really great help in answering these questions and getting them ready for life online as they move forward and as we all move forward. So thank you all for coming. Thank you all for speaking. I really appreciate this, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you.